Perfect. So welcome to this session. We're going to have a tour of Phil's croft. So I just want to introduce Phil. So Phil is based on the Isle of Skye and he has a wildlife background, a little bit more than farming. He's going to talk us through his farm and crofting experiences. And he's also vice chair of the steering group for the NFFN in Scotland. So welcome to Phil. And I think we're a smallish group, so we can take questions as we go along. So I'll be monitoring the chat and I can jump in and interrupt Phil if you have questions as we go along. So feel free to do that. Thank you. Over to you, Phil.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Ellen. I'm going to give you a wee tour, as Ellen said, of our croft on the south of Skye today. And we are on a long-term project here, very much a long-term project of getting what is very difficult land, as we'll see, and making it a productive space while working along with wildlife. So very much a journey, slightly experimental, definitely fun, definitely hard work, but we're starting to get some results already. So I'm very, very proud of what we've achieved so far. And I will demonstrate all the different things we've attempted. Okay, so this is us as we are. This is us facing east. This is our croft here. So many would call us a wooden croft or a croft with trees. Now, crofting is traditionally not carried out in a wooded landscape. Most of the crofting counties in Skye, Harris, Lewis, Orkney are very much open landscapes and have been dominated by livestock, certainly for the last 100, 150 years. We have taken a croft that already had trees on it through planting. We purchased it 5 years ago. We've come forward and rolled with what cover we've got, and I'm going to take it as kind of what we would have done anyway. If we'd got a croft which was bare, we would have done exactly the same thing. But this fast tracks us, and trees take a very long time here. Just try and click on here. There we go. So, crofting being very much a bare land, stock-dominated concept and ideas, we've had quite a few discerning looks and comments and things about our management of our croft. If a croft is put to purposeful use, it's definitely a legitimate activity. Growing trees, growing fruit and veg is definitely a legitimate activity. But from the outside, from a distance, jungle, scrub, all sorts of terms, which are quite intimidating, quite claustrophobic when you're in an open landscape. And many crofts are kept tidy and neat these days for the sake of it in many reasons, not just for having animals on there, but many people do want them to look nice and neat, even if they're not a productive space. They still seem to be purposeful use. And many of our neighbours do run large-scale lawnmowers over their pastures to keep them looking short, but they're not actually grazed in many cases. This is a kind of a typical cartoon that summarizes our situation on Skye, really. We're kind of in the middle there. We're not a garden. This is not a play space. This is not rewilding, as we'll see. It is a managed space, but there aren't many doing a similar kind of journey. So traditional ideas of crofting, you're looking at somewhere where the land has been used year round, very much a community aspect, working with your neighbours, whether it's with small-scale crops, fodder, with your animals. But this is the top and bottom picture here on this slide, and you can see that's the 1970s. Lots of folk working together for what is a crop of, I don't know, that could even be oats on Skye. And then you look at the bottom picture, same croft, and today it's just very rush pasture. And so much of the crofting landscape has gone like that. It's a case of once a lot of the traditional rotational practices stop, you probably potentially improve the croft for grazing, or not improved it, or just then put sheep on or cattle on, and a bit of a slow decline into what you see below. And so lots of crofts that folk are taking on look like that. Lots of folk have crofts that are getting to that stage as well. And running a few sheep on that ground is only going to make it that much worse, unfortunately. The sheep are just eating what grass there is there, and the soft rushes and whatever other plants may be growing there are just getting progressively ranker and ranker. So it's very difficult to take a croft like that and then make it into a productive space again. You could top it, you can spray it, you can do all sorts of things, but you're fighting against nature, and that is a real challenge. And that's something we didn't want to do here. We wanted to work with nature, and we wanted to build up natural capital. We wanted to build as much as we could in terms of good soil, good health, and that we're using that with native flowers, trees, and plants. So very much against the traditional ways of crofting, but the top model is gone. It's beautiful and it has wildlife value, but it's not an economically viable picture. And I only see a few spots like that in a few places in, say, the Western Isles at the moment, where there's to be corn crakes, there's to be corn buntings, there'll be lots of twite and things, but it's very much almost a museum landscape. Beautiful, semi-productive, but not the way Skye's going. Not the way Skye's going. There's not a corn crake within 50 miles of us in Drumfern here. There's a few on the top of Skye. So those kind of traditional rotated crofts with crops and little patches of vegetables and things, they're mostly gone. Here is Drumfern. This is the township where we live in. As you can see, it's very much a rugged and remote landscape. It's taken from the top of our nearest hill. That's a view directly from the east. So you're facing west, and that's the Atlantic right out there. So although we've got a touch of shelter from the slope, we get all the winds that rattle through, and they do rattle through that. It's a southwest facing sea loch, Loch Eshort, and it absolutely hammers through there for many, many days of the year. Gale force winds, but not just the gale force winds, salt laden winds as well. So it doesn't always have to be strong damaging winds. It can just be 4 or 5 days of constant salt on dry vegetation, dry leaves that can cause real problems to anything you're trying to grow, whether it be trees, whether it be vegetables. That's it from the south. So very much a different looking landscape, but still very much open. So to a direct south wind, Drumfern is still in full force of the wind. And you can see the type of landscape that it's sitting in. This is a heather moorland right the way across the south of Skye. It's used for predominantly rough grazing, but it's also a managed deer estate, one of the few deer estates on Skye. So high numbers of red deer and fewer sheep year on year on the common grazings and cattle. And little township of Haste in the background. And here's our croft. And so it's unusual to have trees on it already. Lots of them are going that way now. There's lots of planting schemes across the crofting counties to get trees on there. But these trees here are 15 years old, and so things take a long time to get established. And it's time is on my side, I hope. we never you never know what life is going to throw at you. But our plan is most definitely longer term. So if we're taking on a bare land croft now, wanted to get to this stage, although it could have been planned better, it would be looking at kind of 15. So if you're looking at, say, an agroforestry model where you're looking at a planned landscape with shelter and shelter belts and things, you could have fast-tracked it a little bit better. The trees were scattered all over the croft as part of a forestry grant scheme, I believe, at the time. Planted inappropriately in a lot of places. It's not the best trees in the best places, but some little pockets that are quite good. So the wind is coming from the left-hand side here. And so you can see on our windward side, we do have plenty of trees, and it slopes off gradually down towards the right as well. So we've got relative shelter from the slope and from the trees. And that's pretty much facing south and east. So we do get enough sun as a growing space. We've got adequate shelter at the moment to start things off. But what we're working on is building up soil fertility and just extra cover, and then starting to turn this into a productive space without compromising the high level of wildlife that was built up in a relatively short space of time. So view from the top of the croft, you can see the kind of trees and how they're doing. They are getting there. They're unmulched, kind of unloved trees that once they're away, we've just let them. We didn't plant those ones. We've planted many thousand since. So rounds and hazel. And a lot of birch trees as well, which do well here. And these require no management once they're up and away, but getting them up and away, as we found with subsequent planting, is difficult. And we don't want to be using chemicals, we don't want to be using plastic. And if you're starting to use guards and mulching and things, it's a very labor intensive process. If you can get them away for those first couple of years, it's grand. And lots of the croft we've left as we found it, because we wanted to take a slow approach. we wanted to see what it looks like. So the top of the croft in particular has not been grazed, has not been cut, has not been burnt, has not been managed for 15 years, and more likely grazing before that, we're probably looking at maybe 20 years. We would likely have been overgrazed before that. We certainly, there was quite a high density of sheep on there, and it just sat rank, relatively unproductive and unloved for quite a long period of time. So advantages and disadvantages of that. Obviously, advantages of the fact that there's been no chemical inputs into this, no interference with the drainage. But you often have with stock quite heavy compaction issues built up over the years. And with the rainfall that we've got, which is somewhere probably near 3 meters a year, you get a real leaching of nutrients going down the slope. So you can lose nutrients quite quickly. But with the soil undisturbed here, it's enabled to a lot of deep-rooted herbs and things to get established. And so this is untouched meadow at the top. This is mostly pig nut you're seeing here, but there's lots of other flowers and grasses that are growing very, very well. A little bit of bracken at the top, nothing to be concerned about, though we managed the edge of that. So without any interference whatsoever, 15 years of being untouched, it's actually a very, very good grassland. And if we wanted to cut and remove that and manage it, we could do that. It'd be quite tough in the first year. And some patches we've done that. But if it isn't broke, for now, we'll just leave it. We don't need to worry about that. There's a turnover of nutrients. The biodiversity is very, very high. Lots of bugs and beasties up the top quarter of the croft, and great number of birds and mammals and predatory insects that kind of build up on this basis. And other parts of the croft on the left there, also untouched, and it's absolute pollinator heaven. So that's angelica, marsh woundwort. What else? We've got the meadow sweet there. There's marsh ragwort. There's probably hogweed in the mix there, and that is untouched. So again, without any interference whatsoever, those little pockets have somehow managed to self-sustain and thrive over 20 years. And most cases of abandoned crofts, we haven't been able to give that level of time to see what happens with nature. So that essentially, you can call that rewilding if you wish. We've just left that as it is. If we wanted to cut and remove that and try and keep that spreading around, we could do that, but it's spreading of its own accord. We've seen it in 5 years. The angelica in particular is just continuing to spread, opening the soil up, and the soil beneath that, very, very rich. So little pockets like that are absolutely fine. Some areas are held in more of a ranker stasis though. So areas like that on the right, I've opened that up a little bit. I've had to open it up. That was Millennia, purple moorgrass, and rushes up to the waist pretty much, just thick. The only good bit of ground was around the trees. There's kind of a sphere of influence of the trees of about 3 or 4 meters, where it was slightly lighter grass. I guess the leaf litter and the root systems really opened the pasture up a little bit. Other than that, it just sat with just 2 or 3 species, and it needed quite intensive management to get past that. There wasn't any cycling of nutrients as such. The soil wasn't of much depth. So with brush cutter, I've been doing small patches. So that's a very labor-intensive process over a 3-hectare site, but just doing little bits each year and then monitoring the change after 1 year, and do I then cut again after the 1 year and do cut and remove, or do I leave it? I just do a bit of observing, really, see what species are coming up, whether they're annual, whether they're perennial, and then manage accordingly with the aim of getting as many pollinators as possible. And of course, in terms of a productive space, I'd say this is very much a wildlife space, but as a productive space, we're not growing any food here at the moment. So this is, you can argue, so well, where's the productive side of things? So, well, what we're doing here is that we're building soil health and we're building up pollinator numbers, and we are while we're waiting basically for other parts of the croft to kind of get to where we need to, we're trying to maximize soil health and biodiversity. So it is accumulating and adding, and I'm sure it is accruing nutrients as well. Some of these deep-rooted herbs will definitely be locking up more nutrients than some of the coarser grasses, which tend to operate in just the sort of top 4 or 5 inches of the soil. The angelica roots just go down and down and down and down. And I don't know how many angelica plants we've got over the croft. I would guess somewhere about 2,000 or 3,000 and multiplying quite fast as well. Where we have taken rank bits of the croft and done cut and remove, essentially replicated a hay meadow. We don't have any animals to make hay for. We don't need to manage it according to a certain time of year. We just we've cut and removed and see what comes up, and then we can then manage accordingly. So the knapweed on the left, a beautiful flower. That typically comes a bit later. That's only just finished flowering with us here. So you may have had that in June down south, but with us, it doesn't start really till late July. And we've still got some in flower now. And now the goldfinches are onto those seed heads. We haven't removed that yet. I'll wait till all the seed heads have been worked by the redpolls, the siskins, the goldfinches, twite in good numbers. And then I'll knock it down for winter. What we're doing with our hay at the moment, we are doing a cut and remove. And we're using that to mulch the younger trees we've got. And we are using that mulch for growing vegetables as well. And so we're making our own compost essentially. And we've done a few no compost, no soil experiments of growing veg just by mounding up cut grass and then kind of parting it till you get to the soil underneath. And it's working very well. So we've had our first tatties this year. We've had a good tatty harvest. Potatoes, sorry, for those down south. Of just tatties grown in cut hay, rank hay as well. It's not very productive, rich grass. And we're going to build on that year on year and make beds from that. So that seems to work quite well. We'll do that. And we're not losing any nutrients from the croft as it is. The invertebrates still have a home till quite late on. And we are leaving bits uncut, of course, as well for that. But the area on the right there, that's just 2 years cut and remove from what is Molinia, purple moorgrass, very rank vegetation, which I had to hammer quite hard to get a little bit of soil disturbance as well, and rushes. And so within 2 years of just cut and remove and letting it grow in the summer, obviously that is a key thing. Then unseeded, you have clover. The only thing we have seeded in there is yellow rattle a little bit to kind of knock the sward down a wee bit. But a lovely little meadow after just a couple of years. And the soil, the seed soils must have been there already or from not far away. But we've certainly seen a lot of ground disturbance where we've gone 15, 20 years where we know there's been no disturbance whatsoever, where we knocked them quite hard. There's been a lot of seeds that's just been popping straight out of the earth. So with the way those seeds are and the seed soils, we think they must be in the soil already, which is remarkable really. And that includes orchids, 5 species of orchid that are popping up left, right and centre. So this is a slow approach. And so we'll just keep working on this basis, opening up bit by bit, and where appropriate, do a cut and remove to work on making the meadows as rich as possible. Our trees are growing up, of course, but we don't want to live in a dense woodland. I was talking to Ellen just before the start of this meeting about the Highland midge, and midges are brutal. And the more shelter you have, the more midges you have up here. So there is certainly a trade-off. We don't want to be living in a dense, dark wood. It's very much open and worked landscape we're going for, but with wildlife at the heart. This is looking over to the common grazings on the other side, and this is showing the kind of the way the habitats are going. So that is a common grazings, but that they've decided to take a planting option for that about 10 years ago, I believe. So that is very much an impenetrable spot of willow and birch and alder, ungrazed and untouched. And this is our croft in the foreground here. So we're very much, in terms of the local landscape and the way it's heading, we are in the right direction of what's around here. So we're benefiting from the wildlife that's building up over there, and vice versa as well. So the kind of wildlife that we've seen build up from what would have been a bare land croft with very few warblers and passerines, we're now at 6 species of breeding warbler. We have dozens of willow warblers. I don't know the count of those. We have dozens of those. Sedge warblers, grasshopper warblers, white throats. All of these are not possible in a bare land croft situation. They've all come in. Last year, we had our first spotted flycatcher and blackcap. And that's kind of natural succession, really. As the trees get a bit older, as the vegetation builds up, as the invertebrate life builds up, we get more and more like that. I'm recording through field signs and camera traps, pine martens, otters, fox, stoat, weasel, all range of stuff, but all in a kind of a natural balance. So I didn't want a deep, dark wood, and so we are managing what we've got, and that's the way it will be. And all of the trees we've got here will take some pretty hefty management. We've got a lot of older trees, and they're fantastic for doing whatever you want with. If you want to make charcoal, if you want to use them for firewood, if you just want to use it for kind of brush and wood chip, absolutely brilliant for that. And so a lot of our trees, where we think they're getting a bit tall, they're blocking, they're shading out light, or they're just creating too much shelter, we just knock the top off them. Brilliant for shelter belts for older, because that means they bush out from the bottom. As you can see, they're a great big pulse of vegetation. So if you want to maintain the low level shelter, which is very important for winds, if you do have stock, and we imagine we will have stock at some stage, the wind will definitely be reduced, but you still maximise the light opportunities. And then you've got wood products, whatever you may be. And our stove is and our log store is full of our own firewood, which is grand. Alder as well, very much a nitrogen fixer, and the sphere of influence around a tree, when you're looking at the grassland here, is tremendous. Really great nitrogen fixer that really improves the ground. And you can see where they're going into really rank vegetation, and the rushes and the rank grass just can't cope. And it really has lifted it up. Where we've taken a couple of trees out, where we did a bed, the soil was black, was really, really rich compared just to a few yards away, where it was unimproved, and it was very much what you call a glazed soil. So you can take a poor soil and make a good soil in a very short space of time. Still, in natural terms, a short space of time, but for us working in landscape, time frame 15 years is a long time, of course. But we're not in a great rush, luckily. On the right, one of our birchwoods. So that's what 15 years of a sheltered birchwood looks like. Not bad. If that was down south, I'm sure you'd be disappointed with that level of growth. We've only just started thinning it out a little bit, but absolutely chock-a-block with birds and invertebrates. We've only just taken the branches off there for this year, so we're just letting a lot more light in. We want to improve the understory now. It's not a woodland, really. It's trees on a field, and to get the full woodland picture, you need the understory species that go with it, all the flowers, all the things that go with it. And yes, we have bluebells in places and primroses and some of the herbs that you would expect there, but not much. So that's something we'll work on. And that's something that will need to address across the Highlands and Islands, really. If you want to make a woodland, it's not just the trees. You're going to need to think about what's coming after it. And then imagine we would graze this quite lightly going forward. So I said about planting trees. We were helped out by the Woodland Trust, Croft Woodland Project as well. So we had, I don't know how many thousand trees we've got on the croft already, but they weren't in the most appropriate places for us. And so we wanted to build on that. We certainly wanted hedging, quite a rare thing up here, and you don't see much in the way of hedging on the west coast of Scotland, very much more of an English thing or a kind of lowland Scot thing. But there's lots of grants available through the More Hedges scheme. I'd certainly recommend looking at that if you've got a croft, or the More Woods scheme. And so we got another 1,700 trees from the Woodland Trust about 4 years ago and planted them out. We needed to give them a bit of extra protection because of the grant implications of that. Because of our age and because of our setup, we were to get 80% funding for extra tree cover, which for 1,700 trees is a huge amount of money. And so that'll taking some of the bits of ground which weren't very productive and hopefully turning them into something, but again, on a much longer time frame. And then looking at growing our own trees as well. And that's something we've done for a long period of time. We've been looking at developing our own woodland. It's something I really enjoy. And I'm like a 5-year-old. When I come home, usually my pockets are full of seeds and nuts and all sorts of things that I've just picked up. And around here we do have some wonderful remnant woodlands, native woodlands. So you've got local provenance guaranteed to get all the seed source. And so on the right there, plenty of hazels that are just coming up from the local hazel woods. We're planting those out on the croft, and there's plenty of others on the crofting journey nearby as well. We're happy to give them trees as long as they can protect them. There certainly could be a great market for more trees going forward. And I didn't say anything about growing trees. It's easy, but it takes a long period of time, and so you just need to be patient with that. But it's really rewarding, and you don't need much space at all. You could do it from even just a few pots, a few fish boxes, a few kind of beds you could make your own self. I'm not saying it's a business opportunity in any kind of sense, but it's something you can certainly save money on if you're looking to do that yourself. So our produce is small and limited so far. We haven't made great efforts in these 5 years. We've had a couple of kids in that time and got ourselves established with work on Skye. We've got self-catering on the croft as well, which we've built up. And then it's getting a lot of the cover in. So the important things for us were getting the cover improved. So getting those extra trees in the ground early, and getting more cover in, open the ground up so we can kind of see what we've got underneath in some of the most unproductive places. And then where we can, where appropriate, get fruit trees in. And so we've got about 30 fruit trees in now, started 5 years ago with those. Of course, they often come a few years old. So some of those trees are 7 or 8 years old. And they're fruiting. They're doing just fine. What's that on the left? Keswick codling, I believe. Discovery apples, sunset. So a real range of fruit varieties.
What a crap!
And we've got
setup.
Sorry, a bit of interference there. Sorry, can you mute, please? Sorry. Thank you. And so with 30 fruit trees, we're doing pretty well to just keep them alive. That's the first thing. Will they survive here on pretty difficult ground? The extra shelter of the trees is absolutely vital, though. Without the birch and the older trees, without the willows, we would not be able to cope or survive these trees. They would just get burnt off by the salt winds. They would lose their blossom as well. It would be a difficult growing space. But that's the extra bit of shelter seems to make all the difference. Of course, as the shelter keeps on going, as the soil improves, as these trees spread out, it looks like we've made some good decisions on fruit trees. And I'd really recommend folk to consider them. Finding advice for what grows on the West Coast is hard because there aren't too many people growing. There's a few walled gardens. There's a few crofters who've attempted things down the years. Obviously, fruit sellers and folk want to sell things will tell you a lot of things. That of course, it'll grow well on the West Coast, but it doesn't mean just because it grows in a walled garden on the Isle of Mull doesn't mean it's going to grow on a seaward facing or east facing croft on the Isle of Skye or on Lewis or on Orkney, for example. So the trees will often survive, but whether they thrive is another question. But seemingly with a good mulch and a bit of ground enrichment, they seem to be away. And this winter, we're going to be grafting quite a lot of our own fruit trees and stepping it up a little bit and just having them scattered all over the place. We're not banking on them as kind of a local cider or eating apple just yet. We're biding our time. Hopefully we'll get into a situation within 5 or 10 years where we've got so many apples and pears and cherries and plums and things that we planted that we don't know what to do with them. And that will be a great situation. Then there's more of a business opportunity then. Anything with the Isle of Skye on it sells. You can sell any kind of produce on the Isle of Skye with that kind of marketing. It's such a huge tourist spot that you could make Skye cider, Skye apple juice, Skye anything really, and it will sell, which is it's wonderful. We've also got lovely hotels nearby that Michelin starred and double rosetted places as well. So really top eateries, some of the best eateries in Scotland on Skye. And so they're looking for quality and consistent produce, but also with a bit of a story to tell and local and organic. We're not on the journey to be organic. We don't use chemicals. We essentially are organic, but for us, starting out on a journey here, it's just not worth us looking at organic status here. So we'll just keep going as we're going. And we want to grow as much as we can outside and using the fertility that we've got on the croft with very little inputs, with the exception, I would say, of seaweed, which we've got abundantly nearby. And a lot of our pals who are growers as well, and anyone who's growing the seaweed, once you kind of get all the marine plastic and stuff out of it, is a fantastic fertilizer. It really is all the kind of trace elements that a lot of the plants need. A great mulch that breaks down, good for invertebrates and things. So with our cut vegetation, with a wood chip that we can make from our own trees abundantly now, we're on a journey to kind of being self-sufficient in compost and things, because that's another thing of trying to be environmental is one thing, but when you're bringing in compost, it's like you kind of the footprint balance and everything, it's kind of goes out the window. And same as with chemical usage, if you can help it. But for that, we're not necessarily going to be a croft full of apple trees or potatoes or anything. We're just going to try and do a mixed approach to it. Will we get to a stage where we're selling our produce locally? Yeah, I would like to think so, but that's not necessarily a strong business model for us at the moment. We're just building it up as we go. So within 5 years' time, with things developing as they are, I imagine we'll be in a much stronger position. But we're very lucky to have that option to not have to commit all guns blazing and try and make a business. Most crofters don't make much money from their croft. What, £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 a year from a croft as an output. So it's just a sideline. For 3 hectares of very difficult ground, there's not much more you can do. Most folk don't finish their animals here. unless you've got your own winter food supply. So then you've often got a run of several crofts, so you've got more than 3 hectares to work with. But the majority of folk here just it's on a very small, low intensity basis. So hopefully folk can consider this something that's replicable, but we're talking quite long, difficult timeframes. In terms of support for this kind of operation, this is a horticultural activity. Most of the support that we've got in the crofting counties is very much geared towards cattle and sheep. That's the historical big land use here. So most of the grants are going that way and still heading that way. So for me, looking to get assistance for fencing or improvements on the croft, I'd have to put full business plans in to do that, which is fair, legitimate. If I'm taking government money, if I'm taking benefits, and I fully appreciate that. But if I was to do a sheep operation and again a hard standing for cows, I don't need a business plan. I can just put in for it. So if I wanted to get improvements on the croft, it would be worthwhile me getting animals for the sake of that, and that's not where I want to be. So I've had chats with the various offices locally about how we can, what we could be eligible for to fast track our process a little bit. And all the horticultural stuff, unless we've got a full business plan and proof of outlets, they're not looking at longer term pitches. So we're kind of ineligible for longer term stuff. We want to be honest as well. We don't want to fudge any plans as they are. So the only thing we'd be eligible for in terms of approving our fence, despite all the horticultural stuff, the fruit trees, nothing like that, eligible to this extent, is basket willow. We've found we've got maybe 20 square meters of basket willow, and as soon as we mentioned that at the office, that was something that they think they could fund extra protection for and all sorts of extra things for the production of basket willow. But for the food, it's not. There was nothing there. So very frustrating. Hoping to make some positive changes there and help other crofters kind of get in on the journey. But for us, it's been a labour of our own money and love. Not a huge amount of investment. What you're seeing there in the picture, the polytunnel, is a big investment for us. But still, with all the groundwork and everything, that's probably about £1,700 all in with the digger work that went in. We don't want to be reliant on plastic. I've put this in here to demonstrate the artificial inputs in the plastic that we are using at the moment. That was a woodland trust hedge on the right, and we felt we needed to protect that because of the cost of it. So we've gone with that. And then the polytunnel, which we used as a growing space for this year. It's been a lockdown project, that one. And it's been great for us. And as you can see from its location on the croft, those are some of those 15-year-old trees. We had to clear a couple in there, but we've got a really nice sheltered spot. And so we've been enjoying growing in there. But I don't think we're going to go any more plastic if we can. If we can grow outside, then great. Challenging, most definitely concentrating food in the summer months, but that's when the most people are on Skye. And that's what, there are a few salad businesses, there are a few veg growers on Skye, and they are just concentrating on that summer season. So in terms of what we've got for animals, we've not much at all. We're on a kind of a wait and see process with what we have got. We've got some khaki Campbell, white Campbell ducks, fantastic for the wet ground that we've got, and they are little biodiversity agents. They really are. They have been rooting their way through the really wet, rank ground, and where they have had influence over the winter at very low density, and when they've got the whole croft of 3 hectares to roam over, the floral diversity the year after with stuff that they've brought up from deeper down has been great. So great spikes. We wouldn't be able to monitor all of this if we were grazing it hard in the summer, because all those flowers and herbs would have been grazed out. You wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. But because we're not grazing, or because, well, these guys are grazing on a small basis, same as our hens we've got, then we can actually see what positive effects they're having on the ground. So very much at a low density, ducks have been fantastic. And of course, they're working, opening up a lot of damp areas as well. Good for drainage. Ducks, just a small, we had 5 and we've got 4 hens. So over 3 hectares, that's hardly anything at all. You think that's not really much of an operation there at all. But we're looking to see what's replicable, what's good for the ground. Is there a kind of a model that we can upscale here? And so we're just doing things very, very slowly. Any higher density here, we certainly found that a lot of folk around here have suffered from predation, and we've got golden eagles and white-tailed eagles flying us over every day. So great to see, but if it wasn't for our trees, I think we would probably be losing animals to them. There's fox, otter, pine marten, mink, stoats, all sorts of other things that could take them. So to have a free-ranging operation here, it's quite a challenge. We haven't lost any animals yet, day or night, but we know lots of folk who have, certainly. In terms of the positive influences of the hens, they get into the rank vegetation, which again hasn't been touched for 15 years or so. So they're taking areas where it's full of moss, full of dead grass, leaf litter that is not getting the soil nutrients cycling over. It's not breathing. It's not got any life. There's no opportunities for younger plants and flowers to get in there. And the hens just get in there and scratch it all to pieces over a low density. But what a difference again! Floral diversity has improved with the hens. I'm not going to say it's all positive. With our croft is covered in shrews, voles, frogs, toads, and huge numbers of invertebrates. And despite the fact that we give these guys pellets, they fairly rip through it. I know people say they're good pest control, but they don't know the difference between a good caterpillar and a bad caterpillar. Of course, they eat everything, and that's likely to include slow worms and lizards and things. What they don't eat, they certainly kill, and we see it all the time. And I mean all the time. There'll be a shrew just getting knocked around between them. So the more wildlife you've got on the ground, the more you notice their impacts. If you just put it into a bare bit of pasture, you wouldn't notice any of these things. But because we've got wildlife already, we notice the impacts as they are. So we don't really want to go beyond density for that. Ducks, not the same. Ducks, we have seen ducks eat frogs whole repeatedly. And that is not a sight you want your toddler to see. That's something you won't unsee for a long period of time. But it's less impact with the ducks. So we're swinging towards the ducks. However, I found very early on that I've got intolerance to duck eggs, which is a disaster. So in terms of our own produce, we can give them away, we can sell them, but I can't eat our own duck eggs. So I'm reliant on the hens. Just cover some of the biodiversity on the croft. Because of my wildlife background, I've got a great kind of idea of what species should be where and what to look for. Bird list is high already. We're at 86 species of bird, which for croft of where we are is amazing, and the breeding list is improving year on year, and that includes snipe. Even though we've got woods, even though we've got like orchards and things, we have breeding snipe. There's better habitat nearby in terms of the rushy pasture and some of the wetter moorland, but we've got snipe still breeding here in amongst the trees. In winter, starting probably in the next week or two, as it starts turning really cold, a bit of an easterly, we'll get a woodcock dropping in. We'll get large numbers of woodcock over winter. It's hard to quantify sometimes. We certainly flush them every walk we would have in winter, and large numbers of snipe coming in as well. Smaller birds peak, of course, in the summer, and not so many small birds year round. But right now, everything's just eating weed, seeds, and invertebrates. So it's busy with passerines on the croft. Some migrant, some not so migrant. But not having bird feeders and not having kind of setups in like a garden, and being the only croft with really kind of extensive young woodland around here, we've found that we're much more attractive to kind of migrant birds. So warblers, cuckoos, whinchats, stonechats, as you see in there. These kind of things are very much everyday birds for us here on the croft. And we don't see many great tits or coal tits or blue tits. So very much kind of we feel like we're part of the landscape here. And that includes things like grasshopper warblers and red poles, cuckoos, things that are nationally not doing very well at all. But here in this area, they're doing fairly well. Moths, big interest of mine, moths and butterflies. And in just a few years of unintensive trapping, there are 284 species of macro moth. So just the bigger ones. I don't do the little ones yet. I'm not that specialized yet, but we'll get there. So realistically, where we're probably looking at maybe 350, 400 macro moth species by the time we've done it over a few years. I think it's really quite high. You could get that down south in places. The numbers here as well, when we run a non-lethal moth trap, a light trap, at certain times of the year we can get over 1,000 moths in the trap again, which is pretty good here, bear in mind our latitude and things. And I don't know of anyone locally that has that kind of number, even regionally. So I think the young woodland that we've got here and the relative shelter and what we're surrounded by is really great. But most folk won't appreciate that, won't see that. They might see occasional moth under a light outside, but they won't appreciate the density of stuff that you just don't see. And you can go through the woodlands, you're not seeing much in the way of caterpillars. There's a few bits and pieces, but it must be absolutely covered out there. But obviously just extremely well hidden. So a lot of cuckoos, typically in late May, you would hear 2 or 3 cuckoos at the same time. And they're on the croft. They're eating all the hairy caterpillars on the rank grasses in particular. And it's not uncommon to see 5 or 6 chasing each other over the top of the croft. So that's not just our croft, of course, as positive. They do feed, and they do most definitely go for the willow warblers and meadow pipits and parasitize their nests on our croft. But that's part of the whole landscape situation as well. So very much a cuckoo-dominated landscape. Great, but come about mid-June, and about 3 a.m., your patience, your love of the wildlife, even for me, starts to wear off a little bit when these are right outside the window. Same as the corncrake in the outer isles and things. It's like wonderful when you first hear them, but after a month, you start going a bit mad. I'll just leave on the toad here, because that's kind of what we've. That was kind of the first wildlife we kind of really noticed here. Our first ever walk here, when we got here, we walked up at a kind of a torchlight walk on our first evening. And there were 30 toads on the road. And so we knew we had something which was pretty special for wildlife already. And they're still doing okay if they can avoid all the hens and ducks and things. And we just kind of slowly build it up. And it's very much a symbol of our wet croft, not all the special moths and things, but these guys and all the newts and the slow worms and lizards that we're building up. We've got a real love affair with them. So I'll leave the presentation there. So I'm more than happy to take questions. It looks like there's a lot of questions popped up. So if Ellen, you could direct them my way, that'd be grand.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the tour. I think maybe we should start with Katie. Katie, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your questions? You're asking about surveys and wildlife surveys.
Hi, yeah, finding my unmute button there. Yeah, I mean, it looks fantastic, and I think you touched on the wildlife monitoring a bit later on in your talk. I was really interested to see kind of if you do any kind of year-on-year monitoring. So you know, as your croft develops and you know, you maybe get different species in, do you have a kind of an idea of how that develops with the biodiversity as well?
Certainly, in terms of the succession of the vegetation, and we're taking plenty of photos as we go and try and keep it as formal as we can in terms of using the same spots and things, and so we can monitor the change. It's very difficult to look at patches of grassland and habitats as they go over the years, because you just kind of forget. And when it's tiny little changes or tiny little declines, tiny little improvements, you don't really notice that. So certainly photographs are key for a lot of the floral diversity and the plants that we've got here. As for a lot of the other wildlife, it's very difficult to do a formal kind of baseline survey. We could certainly know an idea of what was here, but as for the relative abundance, a lot of stuff, particularly on the rank grassland in woodland, it's very hard to actually quantify. So the moth trapping, I think, is probably one of the best ways of checking the habitats. Now the moth trap obviously pulls in from wider areas other than our croft, but we can see a change in composition of species. Now that's climate change in many ways, and we're at the bottom of Skye. We're the only one of the few people who do trap on Skye, so we can see what's coming up the west coast, and we've had, I think, 5 new species for Skye in just the time that we've done that. So I mean, it's the stuff that's maybe under recorded, but also coming through. As well as that, a lot of the plants that we have put in, so many of the moths and butterflies, but particularly moths, are tied to individual species of trees or plants. And so if we haven't had those species beforehand, and those, say, if we, like rose, we didn't have any roses on the croft whatsoever. And we didn't record any of the butterflies and moths, sorry, the moths that you would get with roses. And we planted them a couple of years ago. And lo and behold, in the moth traps now, we've got a lot of the moth species that you would come with roses. So there's the streamer moth, a beautiful moth there, barred yellow. And these things just weren't here before. They're probably locally nearby, but moth trapping things really helps that. Butterflies, everyone can kind of notice and record. We've only got 9 species here, so it's really poor for butterflies. But for some reason, moths can do much better. And if we're to get into more difficult groups, hoverflies and things like that, then I'm sure we'd want to do the same. But it's finding the experts to do that is tricky. There's not many folk up here. There's a few retired folk who are really hot on lichens, liverworts, dragonflies, damselflies and things. But hard to get hold of those experts. If you do it professionally, it's a lot of money in that. if you're a dipterist and things, you can do very well out of surveys. So we just have to rely on my anecdotal stuff.
That's great. Thanks very much. I have a slight vested interest because I work for the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and we don't have very many recorders on Skye. So I would recommend bumblebees as your next venture. But as I say, that's my own interest as well. But it's fantastic to see all the different photos and especially all the moths. That's a group I've not managed to get into, yeah, keep it up, keep up the good work.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, I'll take that on board. I do have the Bumblebee book, and there's lots of excellent resources out there. I would love for us to have greater yellow bumblebees here, but I don't think they're present on our part of Skye, and I don't think the habitat is continuous enough for them either. But they're on North Skye, but I can certainly see what we do have and start putting records in. Thank you.
Great question. There's a question from Andrew, I think it's Andrew, about the midges. Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, it's. I'm half Scottish. Used to have summer holidays up in Scotland, so suffered a bit from midges. But the thought of, they are a major food source, I would have thought, for the time of year for most birds. Are there any surveys being done? I mean, and the other aspect is trees create midges, give you protection, and there's a seminar on at 1:30 talking about agroforestry and linked to cattle. Just wondering whether that's appropriate for Skye or so far north. 2 questions, sorry.
No, thank you. That's grand. So midges. You would think, really, with the number of midges we've got here, certainly on the West Highlands, that there would have been more species built up around that. When you see kind of great kind of abundances around the world, there's usually a whole load of predators that come in with that. You don't really see that. We don't have a huge number of swallows or house martins here. We don't have the habitat necessarily for bats, but it's not a huge number anyway. So we're quite a wet and windy spot, and a lot of the insect-eating species are more down south. But the midges have been here for time more, as far as we know. But we haven't really seen the build for that. So I'm thinking, and it's just my thoughts, is actually they don't taste great, because other than that, there should be something that's plowing through. Yes, I'm sure the willow warblers will be taking some here and there, but they're going to be feeding caterpillars mostly to their youngsters and things. So it's not a key time for them. For animals and things like that, there's also kind of a question of welfare, because yes, the more shelter we've got as well, that's great. But I say we get our own midges, and then because of the wind, we're likely to get the midges from everywhere else. They can come for us for a nice little sheltered holiday away from all the wind. So you can get a doubling effect, which is okay. That's probably is biodiversity that's building up, and is micronutrients on a tiny scale that will be amassing. But if you've got ponies or sheep or cows, then there could be a bit of a welfare issue there with the fact they won't have any breeze. Now, in the middle of our croft, we've got power line going right through it, and that's great. And that means there's always a spot where, if we did have animals, they could go and get breeze. And I think that's something. Offering shelter to animals is very important, but also I think in this situation, you probably want to be able to offer them somewhere where they can just get away from it. All the deer in the summer here, they're all on the tops. It's not just for the grazing; it's to get away from all of the midges. So it's certainly something to think about. And I think trees and agroforestry and cattle, I think that's certainly a direction we'd like to head in. I think they're a very useful agent. But looking at our 3 hectares here and the amount of return we get from it, I think a low intensity, low impact, it would be literally 2 or 3 cows on the bottom of the croft. So that's maybe something for someone else's cows, potentially, rather than getting our own setup and all the costs that go with that. Maybe a case of borrowing or letting someone have the summer or winter, depending on what they're looking for.
Well, you could create a cooperative for a number of people who want to use facilities and have a shared facility at specific times of the year.
I think going forward, that's what I'd like to see. Certainly, I'd love to see more kind of cooperation here. Our region of Skye, there's not so much going on. A lot of the crofts are vacant and abandoned. There's not for the want of folk wanting it, but it's the economics of the situation and kind of the rules of succession and things that are kind of holding us up a wee bit. But yeah, there certainly should be an operation of rotational grazing and swapping around. Right now, we're letting our croft grow up in the summer, which many folk aren't, and we're able to see the massive benefits of that for floral diversity and biodiversity that builds up. If we were to start grazing that, we'd want to do it lightly and quite sensitively at first. But what we've got here is quite a rare model of what crofts that are ungrazed and uncut can actually achieve in quite a short space of time in terms of the grassland. Certainly, even if we didn't have the trees, we'd be managing the grassland the same. And so we can demonstrate that to other folk if they so wish. I'm not forcing this model on anyone else's, but I think at least we can demonstrate.
Yeah, I mean, the principle of what happened 200 years ago in Skye, whether it was there were no trees there, whether the trees were all cut down. I mean, at some point in time, did the nature of farming change on Skye? Perhaps it should go back to how nature created it 300, 400, 500 years ago. That's what I'm thinking of.
Since the last ice age, really, I think it would have been Atlantic oakwards for a period, but I think human influence has been here throughout. But dramatically changed really is in kind of the modern world. Once you got away from a folk having a couple of cows and a couple of sheep and a couple of goats and a small holding of their own, basically, of rotating crops around and being self-sufficient, relatively self-sufficient. And then, of course, it gets into more of an economic model where sheep, in most cases, were thrown at every bit of land that's possible on the hill, and including what you call the in-by, the local stuff around the house, which should be for your crops, should be your best ground, should be where you're growing all your veg and your oats and your barley and things. That was then gone to sheep as well. If you throw sheep at something for 50, 60 years, then there's not much in the way of fertility left, because that's what they're basically fertility hoovers if at the wrong density. They just and with our rainfall that we've got as well, it's
and the funding's still supporting sheep as well as cattle.
It is. It's going to that is going to drop out a little bit, I would think. But what are the models that are coming after it? And if you graze something intensively for 50 or 60 years and then stop, it's not going to be a fantastic pulse of vegetation, natural succession. The ground is going to be rank. It's going to be undisturbed. It's going to be mossy. It's going to be rank grasses and sedges, bracken in a lot of places. You need turnover. You need the soil to be worked, and so just reducing animals in a lot of these areas is not going to be doing us any favors, and we'll get caught in stasis for 15, 20 years. But the ground can heal very quickly, as we can demonstrate.
Well, that's it. After tens of thousands of years after the ice age, it worked out what it could do best, I suppose. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily coincide with economic benefits in the present world, though. That's the problem.
Indeed.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. John, can I bring you in? You have made some comments about the having a glass house or the polytunnel, and so made some comments about livestock. Do you want to add your comments?
I was just going to say about the glass tunnel. I mean, we have one at home, and it gives us early potatoes and early carrots, and it gives us a few lettuce leaves going on to winter, so it extends our season. I was going to ask Phil about benchmarking. I wondered if there was a benchmarking group for crofting that would compare outputs and inputs. You know, things like bird counts or how much veg you got off it, just so you could see other people and good practice. And just finally about livestock, I'd see them as your lawnmower or brass cutters, and not as intensive grazers. They could save you a lot of petrol or a lot of electric just by doing the work that you are doing now. But very extensive rather than intensive.
I'll take that first point, the second point there, John, about that. And certainly, I don't want to be. The cutting we're doing is not necessarily so intensive. We do intensive little pulses of it, but I don't want to be a gardener for this land. That's not sustainable. I totally appreciate that. And animals, certainly pigs and cattle, could do a lot of the ground disturbance work and get things cycling quite well at the right densities, as you touched on there. And sheep keeping things, so from getting too rank, particularly. So I appreciate that, and that is our longer term model. I don't want to be using the brush cutter and strimmers or mowers and things for a longer term model, because that's not sustainable. But it's a means to an end right now, and as we planted so many other trees around, we just don't feel we could even. A lot of our folks, friends are saying, "Oh, you should just get electric fences. You could use this bit here, use that bit there." But with a number of trees that we planted, particularly young fruit trees and things, we're just thinking, no, we want to do without that headache for a few years, and then we'll look at getting stock in there. But they are just definitely part of the model, and hopefully we could finish what we've got as well. That would be an aim. rather than actually just doing kind of typical store system here of selling off your lambs and whatever in the autumn. For the polytunnel, a lot of folk are going down the route here because it's fast tracking. Everyone wants to grow these days, and certainly lockdown this year, everyone wants to start growing. It's been great for getting crofters and getting a lot of folk on Skye talking about food. There isn't a benchmarking exercise that I'm aware of. There's a few little Facebook groups. I'd like to see the Scottish Crofting Federation kind of work on that, but they're only small, and they're reliant on the two sides. You've got the younger, a bit more diversification kind of orientated side, and then you've got the traditional side, which you're trying to protect in terms of landscape and culture and heritage. And so they're a bit torn in. As a small organisation, it's very difficult to focus. And there's limited influence so far by the Community Supported Agriculture and Land Workers Alliance and those kind of other growers that you'd kind of like to be able to compare with. So it's starting out, and there's definitely room for improvement there. But there's very few folk growing veg commercially here, doing their own produce. I mean, that's the first stage for us, is to grow as much, if not all, of our own veg, and then we can look at a surplus for that. So that's our first step. And so not necessarily as a business yet, but everything I've said, as I said, it's not a business yet, but we're lucky to be in that situation where we don't have to be forced. Let's see what 5 years brings. Hopefully a much richer space that we can grow whatever we choose to at that point.
Great, thank you. And so, keeping on with the polytunnel theme, Adrian, you made a comment about another project that was using lights and wind. Do you want to share your thoughts on that? Are you still with us, Adrian?
Hi, sorry, I'm just trying to unmute and get my camera to share with you. Try again. I'm an amateur. I'm from York. Working for Good Food York and trying to boost sustainable agriculture. Sorry, I've lost my screen now, so I can't see you at all. But I stayed near Armadale at a place called Ruberfoyle a few years ago, which Phil will probably know anyway. But at the time, the previous owner had handed it over to a new guy who was just beginning to explore, trying to save his ancient woodland, trying to bring permaculture principles in, and thinking about a polytunnel with LED lighting and trying to power the electricity by wind power, given that you've got wind and scope for longer seasons. That I don't know no more about it than that, but there might be interesting crossovers with your crofting approach.
Yes, so Ruberfoyle and kind of permaculture base, that's managed by Ludwig down in Skye. So
Yes.
yeah, we are close relatively, and yeah, he's got some great ideas, and what he's got there, he's got a lot of folk living with him as well, and obviously having that extra labour is certainly a key thing. So at the moment, my labour force is my partner and a 4-year-old, so it's not huge. We could certainly do with a little bit more, and we have had woofers. We've had willing workers on organic farms, and you can do work away schemes as well. And I think that is certainly something going forward. Lots of people want to come and stay on Skye. Certainly a lot of youngsters want to. But if you want to go and hire a pod for a night here, some of the pods are like 70 quid, and for like a tiny little wooden hut.
Yeah.
So if there's plenty of folk who come and gladly return a few hours labour for a bit of effort. That's one thing I should have mentioned before, and I think there's certainly scope for that.
Yeah.
That's rather kind of technology kind of related things. Well, wind is one thing, but it's very expensive and quite difficult to maintain. If you can get grants for something, that's grand. But I've lived on Fair Isle, I've lived in Shetland, I've lived in Orkney, I've some of the windiest places in Europe, if not the world. And yes, it's good to a point, but then the maintenance and the cost of all that, I think it's relatively unsustainable, a lot of those projects.
No, and as I say, I'm an amateur, so living within your seasons is fair enough. And I totally support the idea of woofing. We've got a very good woofing scheme in York, and Tony Chalcroft's one of the directors of the woofing scheme nationally. So it gives people a chance to dip in for a few weeks if they can't buy a croft or be there year round. So it would really spread the knowledge about that and give people the opportunities, people like me, to learn more about it. Thanks very much for your presentation. It's really interesting.
Thank you, Adrian. That's great. In terms of what we need in terms of volunteers at the moment, most of our work is heavy winter work. And so winter on Skye, when you're working with mattocks and rakes and things, is yeah, you need to be a special kind of person for that, certainly.
But as you were saying, the abandoned crofts and people wanting to work on them, I'm sure there is some sort of niche of people who would be wanting to do that sort of thing if you can sort out the bureaucracy and the legacy and everything else.
Absolutely, and I'm optimistic. I'm an optimist about the future of land use. You can look around the townships here and be pessimistic, but I know that there's a groundswell of people wanting to take the land on. I know this kind of model could be fast tracked as well. I think if you wanted to get shelter built up, I think you could really get growing. And yes, the ground is poor, but as I said, we've got all the seaweed we want in the world, all the solar energy we want, all the rain. There's certainly no shortage of rain here. So I think you could certainly work it as a model going forward, and I think that will be the case.
And I think there's a lot to learn from you on the mainland. So Yorkshire, we've got huge industrial farms and a huge need to go to small, younger farmers coming in organic-ish sort of ways. But then they've got a lot to learn and a lot of difficulty getting access to land. So the whole thing about co-ops and your approach of biding your time and doing what you can and seeing what grows is very transferable, I'm sure, to even to industrial agriculture in Yorkshire.
Well, there are 19,000 crofts, and so you think that's amazing opportunity, but also lots of those are unsuitable, even from our point of view of growing, because of the extremes. You know, certainly if you're on the very edge of the Outer Hebrides, it's much more of a challenge than what we've got here. Or if you're in Orkney and things on an outer isle, a real challenge to get shelter and get things going. But you can get it going. It's a good model, crofting, but it does need a little bit of help to kind of get the availability of crofts moving. And it'd be nice to have that replicated. I think they're looking to expand the number of crofts across Scotland, and there are some estates that are looking to do that. There's very little interest from a private landowner to break up his own land into crofts because essentially you kind of give away so much of your control and land. But community groups and community woodlands are things that are looking at doing that. So that's great, taking old plantation sites and things and turning them into a crofts for families to kind of move into. That's grand. So supply is an issue, and obviously some places like Skye, the property prices are massive because it's a desirable place. People come on holiday and fall in love and want to move here, and lots of folk, even this year, the property prices will be very high because everyone's had enough of staring at not only just their four walls, but when they go outside, they're in a city, and maybe that's not what they wanted to be. So a lot of folk have been really looking up here in the model. So the prices we've been seeing are just going through the roof, continue to go through the roof, and that includes for crofts. So if you're a young person like myself, I mean, we worked and saved to get the house and croft. If you wanted to come in and start off with a croft and then develop it, you're going to need, even for a bare land croft, you're going to be looking at tens and tens of thousands of pounds, mostly because they're potential development plots. So again, you kind of separate that a little bit. A lot of issues.
You've probably come across the Kindling Trust in Manchester, who are trying to engineer land to be available to young farmers who don't have a farming background and give them a year's training and see if they survive, because there's a very high dropout rate. But then, so what I'm thinking is some agency to be working at that level with you on the trying to get access to land and training and that sort of thing, as well as people like you doing the actual crofting.
Well, I got involved in the Nature Friendly Farming Network because there was a kind of a lack of engagement nearby, and lack of folk I can turn to and relate these kind of stories to, and it's been great, and it's opened a lot of doors and got me speaking to a lot more crofters doing the same kind of model, and we need more like that. But there's a very low density of population over here, so it's very hard to keep those kind of schemes going without significant funding and drive and impetus to get those started. I think if you're in a populated city, I totally
support the need for revising the funding to suit what the needs are, and especially the climate needs and nature needs as well as people's needs. Yeah.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. There's no more questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask a question and then give anyone else a chance to feel free to come up with any other questions, post them in the chat, or there'll be a chance to just jump in as well in a second. So I was just maybe following Adrian's train of thought as well around, we have looking at a farm start scheme here in Lancaster, and you've been talking about kind of, maybe within 5 years, you're looking at kind of maybe making more I suppose, more of a business out of the crofting lifestyle, maybe. Can you say something about your kind of business plan? Or I realise that I don't get that that's like the main priority for you, but if people were thinking like, can I make a living out of this? Can you say something about where you think they could, or if you think they could?
So in terms of what we've got here on Skye, so you've got a tourism-driven economy. And so this year's not been great, although September right now and October is busy again now. Skye seems to be able to absorb tourists from all over. And that tourism is continuing to grow, some say unsustainably. But what that does mean is that Skye has a good turnover of folk coming through. And so I think if you're going to look at a business, you'll be looking at niche models or value-added products as much as you can. And I think this is true of many small-scale things, but for 3 hectares of difficult ground, you have to look at what you can do that you can specialise in. So yeah, okay, you can grow your own potatoes and things, but you're not going to make any money growing potatoes. You'll be looking at other kind of products. Now, whether it be your own jams, your own chutneys, whether it be your own herb mixes, your teas, wildflower seeds, all these kind of little pockets that kind of build up. But still, it's not going to be a full-time living for anyone, whatever happens here. Our self-catering will be our mainstay, no doubt, but you'll be looking at little businesses. We've got a little agricultural shed as well, so we could go into all sorts of things, including brewing or the like, if we get a stage where we're at surplus of apples, and then who else are growing apples on Skye will sell us their apples. I'm a big brewer, so I think there's a potential for that. But definitely niche value-added products, and I would love that to be lamb and beef and all sorts of things as well. But with a lack of abattoir on Skye, the costs and everything associated with it, there's no economic model there at all, even for aged and conservation grade kind of stock at the moment, as I see it, certainly. And that's from someone who would need all of the infrastructure to get set up on that. So I don't think animals are going to be a bigger part of that. If we were to go upscaling on ducks and things like that, and you can maybe do selling ducks for meat or hens, there's certainly a market for that locally. But there's also the predator issue here as well. And we want to be friends with the white-tailed eagles, not adversaries. So that's a challenge. So I would see certainly selling food that certainly makes a small amount of money for us going forward, but then value-added products going forward, probably anything with Skye on it. Unlikely herbal teas and things, I think is one thing. We were thinking of being a tea plantation at one point. We've got friends in the east that are doing that, and tea would grow very, very well here. But it was quite a high setup cost and things, and it would have been a little bit, a bit disruptive for the ground. But maybe going forward, there's no one else growing tea over here. Imagine Skye tea. I've put the idea out. I've given my best idea away straight away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, that's been brilliant. Brilliant kind of overview and discussion. Has anyone got any other questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in at this point. Okay, well then I think that's probably time to thank Phil extremely much for a brilliant, a brilliant overview and a brilliant conversation in answer to some interesting questions. Thank you all for joining us, and yeah, we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks everyone for engaging. We're on social media if you are interested under Wildlife Croft Skye. So that's the name that we put ourselves up at, Wildlife Croft Skye. So we're on all different mediums, to lesser extent or not. But certainly if you like all the pictures and the wildlife, then Instagram is the main one. Not for everyone, I know, but very good for photos.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.